Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Introducing ExtReact, Adding Powerful Sencha Components to React Apps, hosted by Sencha. My name is Casey Crowder. I'm a Senior Marketing Manager here at Sencha, and will be moderating today's webinar. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Mark Mercado, Engineering Director at Sencha. He's been developing with XJS since version 2. Before coming to Sencha, he was the Director of R&D at Biofortis, a life sciences startup where he led the development of several XJS apps. He is also the creator of Mockaroo.com, a web service for generating large data sets for software testing and demos. Before I hand the mic over to Mark to kick off the webinar, I'd like to take a moment to remind you all that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on demand on Sencha.com as well as on the BrightTalk platform. Additionally, we will host a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If at any time during the webinar you have a question, please submit it via the Q&A panel of the BrightTalk interface. Mark, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Casey. So again, my name is Mark Mercado. I'm an engineering director at Sencha. And today I'm going to talk about our newest product, ExtReact, that allows you to use Sencha components inside of React apps. If you're familiar with the history of Sencha, and I believe most of the audience will be, because most of you, I think, signed up from our database of contacts. So if you're familiar with Sencha, you know that we started out with our flagship product, XJS, which was a fork of Yahoo UI, or YUI, many, many years ago. And so that was back in a time where there really weren't things called JavaScript frameworks. Basically, YUI and XJS was a library of components that would allow you to build a web app that could replace something like a native desktop app. Things that were specifically built to drive data-driven apps, things like grids, charts, forms, and moving all of those things out of a desktop application that you install and being able to put it on the web and provide what is now called a single-page web app experience. And those components were so good and they grew over time that in order to allow developers to build apps that would scale and be maintainable with all of this new power, we kind of had to come up with the concept of a framework to wrap around those components. And that became the XJS framework. People refer to XJS today as a framework, but it wasn't always that way. It started out very humbly just as a component library. So in the, I don't know, decade or so that's passed since XJS was first released, a lot of other frameworks have cropped up. And several of them are more popular than XJS at this point. And one of them that's the fastest growing and probably the one that people seem to like the most is one by Facebook called React.js, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And when I first heard of React and got a bit to understanding it, I was very excited because React, unlike some of its predecessors, libraries like Angular 1 and Ember and others, it takes a component-oriented, pure JavaScript approach to building web UIs. And that sounds very familiar to me as an XJS developer. XJS is essentially the same approach, dividing up your UIs into reusable components and building your UI with JavaScript. And so while React is a component-oriented framework, it doesn't actually come with any components. They didn't start with a set of components like Sencha did. They started with a framework. And so wouldn't it be great, and isn't it a shame, that React developers can't use XJS components within their React app? They have to either use open source components or develop a lot of things from scratch. Well, ExtReact, our new product, allows React developers to do just that, use XJS components within React. And so in summary, basically that's what ExtReact is. It allows you to use all of the XJS components in your React apps without using the XJS framework, but just using the components themselves. So Sencha's invested a lot in this ExtReact library. We first announced that we would be doing something for React at SenchaCon 2016, which was in November. And basically from then until now, we've been pouring a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into building this ExtReact product. So what was our motivation behind doing this? Several things. The first is that as we looked around, there's no really complete component library available for React. There certainly are a lot of third-party components available, a lot of free components, some commercial components, but nothing in a single library that was anywhere near the breadth of what you get from XJS. And so we saw a real opportunity there. And part of not being able to get everything you need from one library brings about this sense of dependency fatigue that I think a lot of modern JavaScript developers are getting. NPM has made it really easy to install lots of little libraries and manage the dependencies in your application, but that doesn't solve the problem of all of these component libraries that you might use in React are on different life cycles. They're managed by different kinds of maintainers. Some are companies, some are single individuals, some are actively maintained, some are not. Others follow React very closely, so as new versions of React come out, the components get updated very quickly, and some of them will lag behind. And so as an architect or a senior developer trying to keep all those components up to date, that can be a very daunting task, and you can have a lot of sleepless nights watching the rapid pace at which React evolves and hoping that when the newest version of React is released, it's not going to break all the different component libraries that you've integrated into your application. So we looked at some of the bigger libraries out there. There's some really nice ones like Material UI, React Toolbox, and others. And those specifically, they all seem to provide a lot of the form of components without a lot of the functionality of those components. So for example, a thing like a list in Material UI, it gives you the look of a really nice material design list like you might find on a native Android application. But the list doesn't come with any real functionality. For example, you can't, it doesn't give you like pinned headers or an index bar to the right that allows you to page through the list easily. It doesn't give you the ability to swipe items in the list to do specific actions. So it's literally just the look of the list. So when you want to actually provide real list-like functionality that people are used to with their native apps, that's going to mean a lot of coding. And that's not the way that XJS works. XJS provides you both the look and the functionality of components. So if we can deliver that to React customers, we think we'd make their lives a lot easier. We also have this big head start when it comes to publishing a component library. You know, we have all these XJS components ready to go, and what we found out very early on when looking at React and the APIs made available to us is that we didn't need to write our components from scratch in order to be able to give them to React developers. With some fairly simple integration code, we could allow React developers to use these components that are already available, which is great for both Sencha and for our customers. It's great for us because it requires far less work than writing everything from scratch, but it's great for our customers in that even though this is a new product, they can be sure that this is going to be a well-maintained, robust product that has stood the test of time because it's building on top of components that have been out and used in production apps for years already. And on top of that head start that I feel we have in the component space is particularly, you know, there weren't many great libraries out there that were as robust and far-reaching as XJS, but there certainly weren't many great examples of components that are in the particular strength that we have at Sencha, which is data-driven business or enterprise apps. Apps that need to display a lot of data on screen at once, that deal with large amounts of data, that need to display data efficiently, and have a lot of interactivity in terms of both the design and experience. And so that's always been the strength of Sencha's components, and we feel like we're going to be really strong in that space in React as compared to the competition. So that was why we spent quite a bit of resources in building this ExtReact library. So stepping back, what is ExtReact for React developers? Basically, it's 100+ components, and these are some of the highlights that I think are probably most worthwhile for React developers, but there's a lot of stuff in the box. So things like grid and list and tree. There's a full-fledged Gmail-like implementation of calendar, various different layouts, certainly all the form fields that you would expect, everything implemented based on the material design UI spec, animations, charts, and then advanced D3 visualizations, and obviously a ton of stuff on top of that as well. And so if you follow Sencha very closely, you know that at SenchaCon in November, we announced this package called XJS Reactor. And XJS Reactor is essentially the integration piece, the code that integrates XJS with React. It's all available on GitHub under XJS-Reactor. And it's what you can use if you're an existing XJS customer who wants to use XJS within React. And so to hopefully head off any confusion before it starts, I want to make clear that Sencha has two different products targeting React, but they both deliver basically the same capabilities. They're just packaged and sold differently. And so we have ExtReact, which is a separate product with a separate license from XJS. It's targeted towards React developers who have really no prior experience with Sencha or XJS. It's meant to be a sort of native experience for React developers. So if you're an XJS customer, you don't have a license to ExtReact. It's a completely separate product. It's sold and renewed a little bit differently. It's an annual subscription with perpetual distribution rights. So if you're new to Sencha, or if you don't have an existing XJS license and you want to use our components within React apps, that's the product to buy. If you do have an existing XJS license, you can just use that license along with the open source libraries on Reactor to use your XJS components within React apps. So you don't need to buy anything extra. You already have the license and the tools to build React apps using Sencha components. ExtReact has a little bit more of a streamlined installation process, one that I think React developers expect, but maybe XJS developers aren't used to. So basically everything gets installed through NPM. All of the components, all of the tooling, everything you need, one command, NPM install, and you have everything. If you're looking to use XJS with React, it's more of a traditional process. So you would download the XJS SDK, you unzip it, and then in your Webpack config, you tell your application where XJS is. ExtReact comes with only the modern toolkit. If you follow this closely, you know that we just released XJS 6.5, and we spent a ton of work building out the modern toolkit in XJS 6.5, so that is very close in terms of API parity with the classic toolkit that we released many, many years ago. So modern has gotten a huge leap ahead, and ExtReact purely contains the modern toolkit. We think that's going to be the best experience for most React developers who don't have a history with Sencha. If you have an XJS license, then you can use the Reactor library to either use the modern or classic toolkit with XJS. So I know of a number of customers who are porting some of their older apps over to React, and they're able to, for example, reuse a lot of the views from those applications which use the classic toolkit simply by using the Reactor library and importing those as components into their React application. So it gives you options there. So again, to summarize, if you are an existing XJS customer, you don't need to buy anything new from us. You can just use your XJS licenses to develop React applications, and you use this open source project called Reactor to do the integration. It's very simple to set up, and I'll go through that. That Reactor piece is part of the ExtReact product, and if you're new or coming back to Sencha, then ExtReact is the product that you want to buy. Okay, so regardless of which product you buy and which license you use, the capabilities are basically the same. And so to give everyone a taste of what it's like to use one of our components within React, here it is. So this is probably our most popular component, the grid. And what does the code actually look like when you use that within React? There it is. And so this is really beautiful to an XJS developer, I think. And just at glancing at this, if you're at all aware of how React works and you have a history of using XJS, I think you can piece together where all the pieces fit. So for example, here we define a grid, we give it a title, we wire it up to a store, and then we list the columns inside of it and point each to a field in the store using the data index property. So I think pretty simple. So let's drill down into exactly how this ExtReact product works. So again, I'm going to assume that most of the folks listening have experience with XJS, and so I'd like to show you how you can use your knowledge of XJS to get a head start developing with ExtReact if you get put on a React application and you want to reuse the components that you've always used with XJS. So as an example, let's look at using the list component. So in XJS, the way that you would use any component, specifically list, is you call x.create, and you pass it a config object with an x type, in this case list. You probably wire up your list with store, and then provide some other config properties. Like here, we're saying we want a grouped list, so we'll get pinned group headers in our list. So if you were to do the exact same thing in ExtReact, this is what it would look like. So you'd import list from XJS, ExtReact, and then you use it as a tag in your JSX. And so the way that components are named, the way that you import them, is it's basically the capitalized, camelized version of the X type. So in this case, capital L list. And the configs from XJS just become the props in ExtReact. So store and then grouped, and that's not a typo if you're not familiar with JSX. If you just provide a prop name instead of a prop and a value, it just equates to that prop being set to true. So those two are equivalent. If we wanted to respond to an event in XJS, we have a listeners config where we list the different events as keys that we're responding to, and then the values are the event handler names or just the functions that get called when that event is fired. So here we could display in the console which record is being tapped in the list through item tap. In ExtReact, it's similar. The convention in React is to use props for event handlers. So anything that is on and then the name of an event is automatically converted to a listener. So that's how we would do the exact same thing in ExtReact. And in fact, we can use some of the other variants of event handling as well. So in XJS, you can configure an event with single true so that it only fires the first time that event is fired on that component. And then all other times it's just ignored. So here we're doing something special on the first show of our list. We're presumably doing something like loading from store. And we can do the same thing in ExtReact just by providing an object instead of a function to our on-show prop. And this is really cool. So if you're going to specify the HTML to be displayed in something like an item in a list, the way you typically do that in XJS is you provide X-template syntax, basically a string, a template string that gets converted to an instance of XJS, X-template, and then the values get filled in. Well, React has a much more convenient way of doing that, which is just basically JSX or React elements in general. And so with ExtReact, any place that you could provide a template, you can provide a function that returns React elements. And it works basically the same way, except it's a pure JSX solution to that problem. And so it actually goes a step further than what you can do with X-template, because in addition to just returning HTML, you can also return components, including XReact components. So basically anything you can do in React, you can do in a template in XReact. And then lastly, if you wanted to build a hierarchy of components in XJS, if you have a container that has children, you would do that with the items array. So here we're specifying a docked item, a toolbar that will dock at the top, and then it has its own child items, in this case a button that has text refresh in it. So if we were going to do the same thing in XReact, you just use child tags. So import toolbar and button, and then use them as tags within your list. Oh, and I actually have a typo there. I forgot to put the docked equals top prop on the toolbar, but that's how you would do it. So a big advantage of XReact over a lot of the other component sets out there is that XReact components are themable, much the same way that XJS components are themable. So without any configuration, XReact components are by default using the material theme. So it follows Google's material design guidelines. You can either choose to use that or one of the other two themes that are available, one that emulates iOS, and then another one called Triton, which is more of a generic flat theme that is a little bit, has more borders than material, and it's a little bit more conservative than material. So you can pick one of those to start from, and then you can extend and modify any of them using the very extensive theming API available with XReact, which is based on Sass. And so you could either write Sass code to do things like change the colors theme, add padding, change fonts. You can literally change anything about any component using that theming API, or you can use our interactive theming application called Sencha Themer that allows you to make all those changes without writing code. So that's an excellent tool to bring designers to the table and have them be able to set up a theme that matches your corporate brand or whatever your design language is without actually writing any code. So I'm going to have a chance to have everybody ask questions at the end, but I wanted to preempt that with some of the most common questions that I hear whenever I talk about ExtReact. And the first one is, for folks that are familiar with XJS, how much of the XJS framework will I use within my React application, right? It's kind of a nightmare scenario to have to use two different frameworks. We don't want that at all. So to be clear, you won't be using things like controllers, view models. Basically, you won't be using much other than the components when you use ExtReact. So React has its own way of controlling state and managing user interaction. Most people who write React applications use the Flux pattern with one of a few different popular libraries like Redux or MobX. So you'll likely be using Flux and all the typical React approaches to architecture rather than things like MVVM and MVC, which is what XJS uses. So you will be using, obviously, the components, and you'll probably also be using the ExtReact data package, so stores, models, proxies. Stores integrate very closely with our big data components like grid, tree, calendar, et cetera, to provide a lot of functionality so you don't have to write a lot of code. So for example, using a store to back a grid, you don't have to write an event handler for clicking on a column header to resort the data in the grid. That just happens automatically through that tight coupling of stores and components. So you'll probably wind up using stores, models, and proxies from XJS in addition to the components, but not things like controllers or view models. Does XReact use a virtual DOM? I recently had a customer, I think, post in the forums saying, you know, we essentially really should have written the XReact components from the ground up in React rather than writing this integration piece reactor and using the XJS components, because we wouldn't be able to take advantage of the virtual DOM unless we did that. Well, in fact, the way that XReact works is it does take full advantage of the virtual DOM. It's really cool. So typically, without XReact, this is the life cycle of components through React. So you define a bunch of components, they get loaded into a virtual DOM, and then React converts that virtual DOM in memory to actual DOM calls to display things on the page. And then the real magic happens when one of your components gets updated. The virtual DOM gets updated, and then React can take a diff between the current virtual DOM state, the previous virtual DOM state, figure out only those little bits that changed, and then make the minimum amount of operations on the real DOM to update your application in as efficient manner as possible. And so that's how React works in general. When you add XReact into the equation, the only thing we're really doing is listening on the end of that virtual DOM. So React still does all the diffing, still does all the lifecycle management, and we just basically get the diff from React. And rather than relying on React to update the DOM, we take that diff and we forward that on to XJS so it can update the DOM for its own components. For components that aren't XReact, anything else, then React updates the DOM. And so the effect is exactly the same. You minimize DOM churn, you make things as efficient as possible. The only difference is that XJS is actually touching the DOM instead of React touching the DOM for the XReact components. So the performance, the spirit of React and the way that it works is all maintained when you use XReact. So can I use components or can I reuse components from pure XJS apps? Folks that do both React and XJS development may be wondering, you know, if I have this great component that I've built for another app, can I reuse that in a new app that's based on React? And the answer is yes, you can. The way that you do it is Reactor comes with this function called Reactify. And you can Reactify any component either by passing a reference to the component's class or just by specifying the X type. And Reactify spits out a React-compatible component class. So basically, you can use that in your render method as a JSX component like you would anything else. So you can Reactify anything you've already written, and it works just like any of the built-in XReact components. So I hope that a lot of you take from this webinar and go and try out ExtReact. So I wanted to give you an idea of what it's like to go and get set up to try ExtReact locally. So you're either going to be someone who's new to Sencha, in which case you'll hopefully choose ExtReact. And if you do, the first thing you want to do is go to Sencha.com, find ExtReact in the products list, and sign up for a trial of ExtReact. When you do that, we send you 30-day credentials that you can use to log into our NPM registry to download the bits for ExtReact. So once you get that trial activation email, use that with an NPM login command. And what that basically does is tells NPM whenever you download something in the @XJS scope, download it from Sencha's registry instead of npmjs.org. So if you're an ExtReact customer, then you can use Yeoman to create a new app if you don't have an app that you're already looking to add ExtReact to. So you can just npm install globally the Yo command line utility for Yeoman, and then the ExtReact generator for Yeoman. And then you just type yo @xjs/ExtReact, and it'll walk you through a simple little 5-step wizard to create a new ExtReact application. And that app uses React, React Router, Webpack, Babel, all the usual suspects, and gets it all configured for you and up and running. If you're a current XJS customer, then what you want to do to start a new app is on the XJS Reactor repo on GitHub, which is organized as a mono repo, so it has all these different packages inside of it. It's got a Reactor Modern boilerplate and a Reactor Classic boilerplate. Depending on which toolkit you want to use, take one of those, download it, copy it, and that's a good place to start with all the proper configurations to run XJS inside of React. If you've got an existing app that you want to add ExtReact to, then what you want to do is there's a few dependencies to install. So npm install save Reactor and ExtReact, and then there's two things, tooling things that you have to install with save dev, the Reactor Webpack plugin and the Reactor Babel plugin. If you're an XJS customer, you'll do something similar. You just won't install ExtReact, but instead you'll download and unzip the XJS SDK from Sencha.com or the support portal like you do for any other XJS app. Okay, so once you've got the product downloaded, then the next thing to do is upgrade or update your Webpack configuration. So there is a Webpack plugin called Reactor Webpack plugin, and basically what it does is figure out what components you're using in your app so that only those components are used in the final build that goes to the customer in production. So it minimizes the size of the build greatly. Sencha has always had this problem that's probably unique to us, which is we have so many components in our library that we need a way to tree shake out all of the things you're not using. And so that's what that ExtReact Webpack plugin does. So if you're a ExtReact customer, the only thing they'll probably specify in terms of options there is the theme. Theme material is the default, but if you wanted to use one of the other ones, you could override that. If you're an XJS developer, then there's a few extra things you have to add. This is where you specify the path to where you downloaded the XJS SDK. And the boilerplate instructions always say to just basically do a symlink to the ext folder within your application. That makes it easier to share projects between folks, but you can provide a full path there if you want. You specify the toolkit. Modern is the default, but you can use Classic. And then the packages that you would use. So that's similar to what would go into an app.json file if you're an XJS developer. And then last but not least, to help minimize the size of the bundle, we need you to use a Babel plugin. And that can be used whether or not you're using ES6 in Babel or you're using something like TypeScript. You can use the Babel loader after TypeScript's been loaded to use this plugin. So you can figure that either in your Babel or your Babel RC or in your Webpack config for the Babel loader. And then last, the way that you launch your React app needs to change slightly. So you're probably used to doing React DOM.render your root component into some DOM component. With ExtReact, we provide a launch function. So you pass the root component of your application to that launch function. And basically what that does is it sets up a viewport and some other bootstrapping things that help ExtReact components work for full screen, single page apps. Okay, so I'm going to get on to demoing some of the components, but I wanted to point out that if you don't want to go through any of those steps to download and set up ExtReact locally, you can try it out on fiddle.sencha.com. If you just add $ExtReact, it sends you to a special configuration of Fiddle that's set up to run React. So I'll just show that right now, and then I'll show some of the components. So let me bring over my window here. So when you arrive at Fiddle with $ExtReact, you get this little React boilerplate, and you can run it. And there you have our little hello world. If you wanted to add components, you could do something like let's add a button. And instead, let's do button text equals hello world, and then handler equals x.toast hello. And let's make that an arrow function. And what did I do wrong? Did I not end my tag? I didn't end my tag. That's what happens when you have to scroll off screen. So there we can click. And so you can build full ExtReact applications in here. And this is a great way to learn about the product. And then also, if you find something that you're confused about, or maybe you think you've run into a bug, you can go on our forums, create a fiddle, save it, and then it's a great way to interact with our team to help provide us context of what you're trying to do, and then we can give you help or potentially even a fix if there's a problem using Fiddle. Okay, so if you're familiar with XJS, you know that we have this thing that we call the kitchen sink that shows off a ton of different examples of each of our components. We recreated the kitchen sink specifically for ExtReact so you can do the same things there. So if you go to Sencha's website here, Sencha.com, and then you go Products, ExtReact, and then scroll down where it says Explore Interactive Demo of the Components. This will take you to the ExtReact kitchen sink. We'll see that. And there's a bunch of things here that I want to show you to kind of give you an idea of the value that we're providing here in terms of the components. You might be familiar with some of these, you might not. So the first is one I alluded to earlier, and that's list. So a lot of the competitors get about this far with a list, right? You can scroll, it gives you the look of like something that might be like a contacts list on a mobile app, but there's not a lot of functionality. This is the most basic form of list. And if you click on this little code button here, you can see the code behind that list. So here, we're defining our list, we're giving it a shadow, we're using a function for the template, so we're rendering React elements for each item in the list. So, for example, first name and last name, and then title with some styling. And then we have an event for selecting an item in the list that just simply toasts the name. And then you can see here as well how we're doing some adaptive design. We're saying on something that's not a phone, we're setting some props that wouldn't be active on a phone. So there's a whole way to do both adaptive and responsive design by setting different props with something like this platform config here. Okay, so that's the basic example, but where ExtReact goes a lot further is things like grouping. So here we have a list that pins the headers as you scroll for grouping in your list, and then it also gives you a index bar as well. So you don't need to write any code to implement, okay, now I've scrolled to the position where this header is about to go off, now pin the new one. That's all built into the component, as is the index bar functionality. And then going further with that, for example, you can there's a plugin that allows you to do pull refresh. So as you pull down, it'll display the little refresh thing there. And then there's also a swiper functionality as well. This is really cool. So as you swipe left or right, you get this nice little accordion swiper. So you can swipe over, and then you can click message, and it would fire off an event. So really easy to set up. You just basically put in this list swiper plugin. You specify the things that you want on the left and right side, and then the event handlers for when that action is committed. So these actions are also undoable as well. So for example, as I swipe over, what it's showing me is the things on the right here. We have a message button with an icon, an edit button with an icon. They both have commit handlers. So on message, when I tap there, what it's doing is it's calling this function here to toast what's in the current record. But presumably, you would open up a new email message when doing that. So a lot of cool stuff in lists, and that gives you an idea of you're not only getting the look of a list component, but you're also getting the functionality of a list component as well. So another one that XJS developers are used to, but maybe React developers would see a lot of benefit from, is layouts. All the layouts in XJS are available, things like card layout, fit layout, HBox and VBox. And if you're only familiar with the classic toolkit, then you might think that things like HBox and VBox actually use JavaScript to size things. Well, that's not the case anymore. They both use Flexbox and basically the native CSS3 capabilities of the browsers to do that. So it just provides a really nice way of being able to do this kind of alignment within your JSX rather than having to do it in CSS. In addition, the layouts are also resizable dynamically. So things like docking panes that are resizable, like for example for a menu or for a search bar, you can do that. You can collapse panes as well. You can have them snap to different places. So you can have a fully responsive and dynamic UI by using docking and VBox and HBox in this way. Another really important layout is the card layout. One of the things that's difficult about React is because you transition from one state to another kind of instantly, animating the transition between states is a real pain. And where this comes up a lot is with routing. So if you wanted to, when you're drilling down from a route that's like maybe /contacts to /contacts/ID, you might want to have kind of a swipe right effect to simulate this concept of drilling down. So you can use a card layout plus the configurable animations on it to do something like that, where you slide the UI left responsive to a route change. So card layout has a bunch of different things that you can do. You can fade between them. You can do crazy things like pop. You can cover, like in PowerPoint, or the opposite of that is reveal, so you're pulling away. But you can do any of those when transitioning between cards. And that's a great way to simulate a kind of master detail UI scheme in your application. And then on top of that is a really handy component called transition. And this one is built specifically for use with React Router. So actually, when you navigate between components in Kitchen Sink, like I'm doing here, it's using this transition component. And so that when you swap out one route for another, rather than it just transition immediately and have no animation, what transition does is it basically animates out the old component while animating in the new component. That may sound trivial, but that's really difficult to do with React Router. So you get that out of the box. So basically the way it works in code is you just wrap any component in a transition, and anytime you change the content of the transition, it will animate out the old one, animate in the new one. So we can see that here just by flipping through. What we're doing is basically just ripping out the old container and putting in a new one as we flip, and it animates those. And you can control, the speed, make it really slow. You can do, different animations, like I can fade, and I can change the function that it uses to animate, whether it's like linear or easing in or easing out. So that's a really handy one. Moving on, support for tabs. Really nice. So these material design tabs, you can have them centered like this by default. You can have them on the bottom, so it's more like a mobile interface. They can have badges. You can have them be closable, like you have here, where you can close a tab and can add more. And you can also just use the tab bar alone without the tab panel. So if you wanted to simulate the look of tabs, but you have something that's a bit more complicated than just displaying the UI inside them, then you can use the tab bar on its own. Another one that's really useful is sheets. So if you want to have like a hamburger menu, kind of like we do here in ExtReact, then the way to do that is with a sheet. So here we have a modal sheet slide in with items, but you can also have it reveal in, so basically the app gets pulled away and shifted off to the right, and the sheet is revealed. So that's a great way to implement either things like action sheets, which would slide up from the bottom, we do that, or just like hamburger menu, which might slide in from the left or the right. Obviously, probably the biggest, most important component for our customers has always been grid. I showed a little bit of example of that in the slides earlier, but I want to just give you an idea of all the stuff you can do with grid. There's a lot to go through there. I won't bother going through everything, but grids can do all sorts of crazy stuff, from simple things like formatting the cells with colors to having sparkline charts within the grid cells. You can have different components in there. You can actually use JSX to render inside a grid cell. Grid cells can be editable. They can have content that you expand. There's a plugin that you can use to export grid data to any of these formats, which is really handy. I know on all the applications I ever worked on, everybody always just wanted to export grids to Excel, so we give you that in the plugin. There's a way to do a multi-row selection model, so you can do operations on grids. It's a really fully featured component. Here we see grouping, just like you would get in a list. There's summarization, so you can add up things at the bottom here. Interactive widgets, like changing the rating of an employee in this case. It's very, very full featured. And then on top of grid, we also have, well, let me show you one more thing here. So grids also function like spreadsheets as well, and this is fairly new in XJS, but you can have a flexible selection model where you can say, let's see, sensible, both, selectable, all, where you can select in both directions, and it basically works like a spreadsheet. You get to know what coordinates are being selected, and you can do things like I want to export these certain cells, or I want to do something with those cells. So everybody always wants spreadsheet-like functionality. You get that with the grid plugin. And then last but not least with the grid, so there's a powerful component called Pivot Grid. If you're familiar with Excel, I'm sure your users are. Excel has this capability of doing a pivot table, which basically turns your spreadsheet into an aggregation and summarization engine. And so this is something that the user can configure to slice and dice data however they want. And so this is all just basically built in, where the user can change the orientation of the data in the pivot grid to get new aggregations and new groupings. So if your users are ever asking for like an ad hoc report building functionality, or you're building any kind of an analytics application, that's a really cool component to use. See, so I mentioned calendar before. So if you have any kind of scheduling in your application, you can basically get Google Calendar for free in your application with one component. If you look at the code behind this, it's really simple. It's just one tag, calendar. You feed it a store. You give it some configurations as to how you want to orient days of the week and how many days to show, and you get this full featured calendar functionality. This is kind of the all-in-one calendar, but you can also just take, like, you want to just show a week, or just maybe show a day. You can do that as well. Trees, obviously a very important component. There are two types of trees in ExtReact. There's the tree list, which is really handy for like navigation. It's fairly simple, but it's really flashy. And it can also be used like in a docked kind of micro mode. So if you have responsive props in your application, and as the user shrinks the screen down, you want to switch from the big view to this kind of view, you can do that. So that's tree list, very simple. A bit more powerful is tree. The tree is actually built on grid. So this is a pretty simple looking tree, but you can use a tree as any column in a grid. So you can have essentially a multi-column tree. Here we're like aggregating for each node. But it's really powerful, and you can basically use all the functionality of grid and tree together. There's a very expensive charting set of components in ExtReact. So if you think about what you're getting already, all of these components that I've showed so far, plus a charting library all in one, that would typically be at least 2 different libraries with any other solution. So all the stuff you would usually expect, plus some really cool things that you might not. So for example, here's like some 3D column plotting. You can do stacking and grouping, and it animates between them. As you refresh data, if I can find one of these that's refreshable, it animates in real time. So this can be really cool if you're actually doing something like a WebSocket connection to get real-time data. The charts are all themable. You can change the colors. Very cool, very interactive. And there are also some very domain-specific charts, like box plots, really nice for science, financial charts like candlestick charts. And they all can be panned and zoomed on a mobile device as well. And then last but not least is the D3 components. So we have a bunch of advanced visualizations using D3. So like this heat map can build these things with ExtReact as well. So they all update in real time and have really nice animations as new nodes come in and out. The heat maps can also be configured with a pivot configurator. So basically, you can have your users control the aggregations in a heat map in the same way that they can with a pivot grid. So you get the same kind of configuration UI, and they can basically reorganize the data however they want. That's really cool. And then there's also, going back here, hierarchy. There's also a few different hierarchical charts as well, like organization chart, which draws those nice spline lines, tree map as well. So a lot of these powerful kind of ad hoc visualizations that D3 provides, we wrap those and place those in ExtReact so that they work with the data store and can be used alongside all the other components. So that's just a taste of all the things that you get with ExtReact. And if you think about, all the work it would take to implement even a small set of those on your own, or to have to pull in third-party libraries to be able to get all of that functionality in a way that all those libraries look like they match the branding of your application and they're all themable, that's a very tall order. So we hope once the React community finds out about ExtReact that they'll realize the tremendous value that you're getting in one library with all of these professional battle-tested components. So thank you very much, everybody, for giving me the opportunity of presenting this labor of love ExtReact project that I worked on. And so with that, I'll take any questions that the audience may have.
All right, thanks, Mark. Nice work. We do have a couple questions coming in from the audience. I'll go ahead and ask the first one here. How does the license model work, and is source code available?
Yeah, so the license model it's an annual subscription. So as long as you're maintaining the application, you would renew on a per developer basis annually. You can buy a single license. And if you choose not to renew, then you can still distribute your product perpetually. That doesn't end. But as long as you're developing, you're supposed to renew your subscription. And as far as open source, the integration bits, the Webpack plugin, the Babel plugin, and all the examples, those are up on GitHub. The actual ExtReact components, they're open source in so much as you can get access to the source once you're a customer, but you need to be either a trial customer or a paid customer in order to access the actual code behind the components. But all the integration stuff is totally in the free, and we actually accept PRs for those on GitHub.
All right, great. We've got another question here. Does ExtReact play well with Redux?
It does. In fact, the kitchen sink uses Redux, and most of the examples that we provide use Redux. In fact, the one kind of fully fledged application example, if you go to the ExtReact page here and go to examples, there's this conference application that we wrote, and this all uses Redux in addition to React Router as well. So if you're using Redux, you're in luck because we have a lot of good examples of using Redux with ExtReact. And in fact, I just recently wrote a blog post that dives into a couple of different ways that you can use the XJS data package and XJS store with Redux and how the two should be oriented with respect to one another. So that's actually my Flux implementation of choice for stuff I do outside of Sencha. So we have great support for Redux, but you can use it with any implementation of Flux. Casey, John, I'm not hearing you if you're trying to talk.
Oh, hey, Mark, sorry about that. We do have a couple more questions here. So the next one is, can we expect component definitions to be identical between XJS and ExtReact?
Yeah, absolutely. You get all the same components with both. And so if you're used to using a particular component in XJS, you'll be able to do all the same things in ExtReact. We don't limit it in any way. The components are the same underneath the hood. It's just the way that you interact with them and create them is different. JSX versus ext.create.
All right, great. I've got another question here. It's kind of a long one, so bear with me.
Yep.
We're considering rewriting one of our XJS applications from scratch, and considering XJS and Reactor and ExtReact right now. Between ExtReact and XJS plus Reactor, which product do you think will have greater long-term maintenance by Sencha and the XJS community? Will we get stuck behind after a while if we're using one or the other?
No, I mean, it really doesn't matter because the 99% of the code for both is shared, and that's the XJS components. So obviously, we're not going to be abandoning that product ever. And ExtReact on top of that is a pretty small slice of code. So those are probably our two most important products right now, and we expect those to be very important to the life of Sencha going forward. So I don't think you should let that drive your decision. It's really more of if you're planning to have your developers work both on XJS apps and React apps, then you probably want to just buy XJS licenses and use them, get double bang for your buck. If you've got separate development teams that don't overlap, or if you're moving away from XJS, hopefully you aren't, but if you are moving just to React purely, then you would use ExtReact. It's more of a licensing question, not really a technical question.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Mark. Another question here. Would we still use Sencha commands?
Well, in both cases, you're using it, you just don't know it. So you don't have to download it and maintain it and configure it. You really have no direct interaction with Sencha command, either with XJS plus Reactor or ExtReact. The Webpack plugin has an NPM wrapped version of Sencha command as a dependency. So it handles all that for you. What it basically does is it crawls your code, looks for the components that you're using, and feeds that information onto Sencha command so that command can build a minimal bundle. But you don't have to worry about any of that. It's all just automatic.
All right, great. A few more questions here. Can ExtReact be used as an alternative to Sencha Touch?
Yeah, absolutely. So the history of Sencha Touch is it used to be a totally separate product from XJS, and then it kind of got folded into XJS as the modern toolkit. So all of the touch-oriented device components are now part of XJS. So if you were a developer coming to XJS for the first time, you wouldn't be using Sencha Touch anymore. You just use EXD 6.5, and you get all those components built in. And with XReact being built on the modern toolkit, it has all those evolved versions of those Sencha Touch components that you're used to. So yeah, absolutely, it can be used as a replacement for Sencha Touch.
All right, great. Kind of a two-part question here. Why introduce XReact if I already have XJS? And are there things we can do in XReact that can't be done in XJS?
No, there's nothing in terms of what you can do with the components, they're equivalent. So if you already are developing XJS applications and you have no plans to do any React development, there's no reason to even consider XReact. XReact, or the Reactor library, is more for folks that have already decided they're going to do React development. For one reason or another, I mean, most big companies have some React development going on, and so it's either for folks that are just pure React shops and don't care at all about Sencha but really need these components, so they would choose XReact, or if you're a mixed shop that does both, then you might use XJS with the Reactor library so that you can maybe reuse some of your either XJS components or just your XJS knowledge in your React development. But if you aren't doing React and you're a happy XJS customer, there's really no reason to even look at XReact.
Okay. Next question. How would you suggest populating our components via service calls or AJAX requests?
So some of that depends on the framework you're using, or not the framework, but the architectural pattern you're using. So in React, the most common way is with something like Flux or Redux, and for Redux I've always used Thunk as a middleware. So basically in your action creators you can make AJAX requests to fetch data. For some of the components, things like Grid that have a lot of built-in data fetching functionality, I would suggest using a proxy on the store, especially for things like doing remote sorting, filtering, and caging. And there's a really good example of that on the examples page. If you go to this XReact REST example, it's not hosted on the website, but you can download and run the code with a few simple commands. It basically shows you how to implement a backend for a store proxy. It's a simple grid that allows you to search through the grid and do filtering and sorting on the server side. So that's a really good example to look into if you want. So it'll probably be a mix of AJAX requests through your implementation of Flux and using proxies to do this kind of very efficient data fetching for these big data components like grids and charts.
Okay, thanks, Mark. We've got time for just maybe one or two more questions. What does the annual subscription include?
So basically it includes a certain amount of support hours. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but you get the ability to go onto the forums, to file tickets in support, to interact with the XJS team, and then also just the license of being able to develop and use the components. And again, if you at some point reach the end of your development for that app and you choose not to renew, then you still have the rights to distribute the app perpetually. That never goes away.
Okay, and I think we've got 1 minute left here for, can XReact be used with React Native?
No, XReact is purely for React.js or React Web. Reason for that is, we're building on top of our core competency, which is this XJS library, which uses the browser and the DOM. And React Native doesn't involve the DOM at all. It's rendering to purely native phone and device controls. So it's really not something that we can leverage any of our existing tech. We might go there someday, but not right now. So XReact purely for React Web.
All right, great. Well, we're just about out of time for today's webinar. Mark, thank you so much for the fantastic presentation and Q&A. I'd like to remind everyone today's webinar was recorded, and you'll be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recording shortly. Once again, thanks everyone for attending today's webinar, and we look forward to you joining us next time.
All right, thank you, everyone.